Hi, my name is Casey Keel, and I'm going to talk to you about making proficiency rubrics, specifically if you are a middle school ELA teacher and looking to make assessments for your students who are doing either reading assignments or writing assignments. So when I talk about proficiency rubrics, some of the benefits for using a proficiency rubric, the first one would be if you have gone through the selection of selecting priority standards, you might call them like power standards, and you've done that, it makes sure that you're continually assessing what they are, making sure that you're teaching toward them, that you're understanding your standards, and also just revisiting what the meaning of those standards are, asking for the grade level you teach. Say you teach sixth grade, what does proficiency look like on a specific sixth grade priority standard? And you're revisiting that over and over again. Another great benefit for using proficiency rubrics, they're an awesome tool to create a high functioning PLC. So if you are a part of a team of teachers, you teach sixth grade language arts and you have a couple other teachers on your team, it's a great way to define proficiency together and be able to have that consistent grading where you are able to grade things the same way, and have great conversations about what you're wanting to grade. It's also a really nice thing to start at the beginning of a unit together and use it as that backwards design tool. So start by making the proficiency rubric and asking, what do we want to assess? How do we want to assess it? And then use that to drive the instruction that you want to meet that. And then the other piece there, it leads to really meaningful conversation. So if you guys have some common collaboration time to bring student work and use your proficiency rubrics you've created to see how you are utilizing those rubrics, it's a great way to communicate with each other. It also makes standards-based grading much more clear to students and to parents. So you can go through the rubric with students. You could use it as even a self-assessment tool for students. It's something that they can share with parents if parents ask how something is graded. So I think that it makes a lot of sense to use proficiency rubrics. What should you be making them for? I would say any formative or summative assessment that you do. If you don't have any proficiency rubrics yet, you could start by doing your summative assessments. I think those are probably the most important place to start. But your formative assessments, anything that you give students that you enter into the grade book, anything that's based on a specific priority standard that you have, anything that builds to that end of unit summative assessment. Those would all be places that I would suggest making proficiency rubrics for. Additionally, if you do a really great job of making your proficiency rubrics for your formative assessments along the way in a unit, this is really nice because then at the end of the unit, you can use those same proficiency rubrics that you've built to recycle for your summative assessment if your formatives are building to your summative. So some qualities of proficiency rubrics. They should be based on priority standards. So if you don't have a standard for having great coloring, that's not something that should be on your rubric. So it's a really good basis for knowing what should go on your rubric and what shouldn't. So it should be based on those priority standards that you and your team have selected. It should also be written specifically for the formative or summative assessment that is being given. So instead of having a general rubric that you're using to assess every time students turn in an exit ticket, they really should be written specifically to that exit ticket that you're giving. Next, they should be written to reflect the teaching and learning that has been done. Therefore, they should probably change slightly every year depending on what you taught and how you taught it to students. Proficiency rubrics should also clearly define what a 3, 2, 1, or 0 is for each priority standard. So as I alluded to a little bit, sometimes where proficiency rubrics go wrong would be if they're not based on a certain priority standard, they're just based on kind of what we want to look at. The next one is if they're very general and written to be used over and over again throughout the whole year. I think you can have like a base rubric maybe, and then you could be switching it out. But Depending on what the assignment is, it really should be specific to that assignment, especially if you're wanting to use it with a team of teachers and have that consistent grading and that clear communication tool for students to know what you're expecting. And the last one, sometimes the descriptors, it's really easy to do a nice job on what the 3 is, and then you get to a 2 and you use words like, well, it slightly does that, and then you get to a 1, it minimally does that. Well, actually taking a step deeper of what does that really mean? And I'll show you a specific example of what I mean by that. So now let's go ahead and build a proficiency rubric together. So in the links below, I will put the link to this template. This is going to be a link that makes you have a forced copy of the proficiency rubric. And you can go ahead and follow along with me if you want to build a rubric with me. The rubric that you see on the screen is just what it will look like when it is done. If you are doing a larger assessment, it is totally you would probably have multiple priority standards, and so there would be more rows in this, but this is like for a formative assessment looking at one priority standard. So the first one, title your assessment and pick the priority standard that you are assessing. So you probably know what your assignment is about, and then you would just enter whatever that priority standard is into the furthest column to the left. For this particular assessment, I'm using standard R.2, which is determine essential idea or theme and or provide a summary, and I'm focusing in on that providing a summary. The next step is to define the proficiency for the priority standard being assessed and for the specific task you are asking students to do. So as a school, you probably have a scale that you use. I'm using the 3-2-1-0, 3 meaning meets proficiency, 2 approaches proficiency, 1 minimal proficiency, and 0 would be no evidence. So like I said, you might have something slightly different, and that's totally fine. Everything that I'm seeing will still work with your descriptors and the scale that you are using. So the first one, I like to start with the 3 to really ask yourself, what are you asking students to do? What does meeting proficiency look like for this task and this priority standard? So the task that I'm using is asking students to write a chapter summary, a bulleted chapter summary. So proficiency would mean the chapter summary includes the most important events in the chapter. The events are listed in chronological order. The summary is objective, and it does not contain any opinions about the events. It just sticks to stating the events. And the summary also includes the names of important characters and places mentioned. So you can see those pieces of criteria are very specific of what I'm looking for students to do. There are also things that students can almost check for, like a checklist. Did I do this? Did I do this? Next is the 2, and I find this the hardest level of proficiency to write about and to think about. I mentioned that I see a lot of proficiency rubrics where people kind of throw in that word like, well, almost does this or slightly does this, but doesn't really say what didn't they do. Try to be really specific about what's the little thing that you're noticing that students aren't doing to get the 2. Yep, they're close, they're approaching, but there's something they did where they just didn't quite get there. What are those specific places it goes wrong? So in this case, I defined a 2 as the chapter summary includes most of the important events, but may include some insignificant events and or be missing an important event that happened. The events are listed in chronological order, but one event is out of place. The summary is mostly objective with the exception of one opinion, and the summary includes most of the names of characters and important places. So you'll probably be thinking that there are students that will probably get 3s in one piece of criteria, 2s in another piece. And that is totally normal that you might be seeing students get 3s, 2s, and 1s on the different criteria. It'll be up to you kind of to decide their overall proficiency level based on what you think is most important and where they scored on the different pieces. A lot of times too, students will fall into kind of that 3-2-1-0 for a majority of the criteria. So next is the one. And this is where you want to think about how is that student showing minimal proficiency? What have they attempted to do? That word attempted is very important because I think when students are receiving a one, they minimally got the concept, but they did attempt to do something. And where are those big gaps? What are they missing? So in this case, for a one, the chapter summary includes only some of the important events, but is missing several important events or includes several insignificant events. Several events are out of place and are not listed in chronological order. The summary includes several of the students' opinions about the book and is not objective. And then the summary uses pronouns like he or she instead of characters' names and doesn't refer to actual names of places the events occurred. And then a zero, yes, you have to define what it is that students are doing nothing. How did they provide absolutely zero evidence of proficiency toward meeting this priority standard? So the chapter summary does not include events from the chapter. Maybe they listed events from a different chapter, or their reading comprehension was so off that they weren't able to accurately describe any events that happened in the chapter. Events are listed randomly and not in any sort of chronological order. The summary is based on the student's opinion of the chapter and is not objective at all, and no characters or places are mentioned. So now that you have built a proficiency rubric, the next step would be to test out your proficiency rubric. And once again, if you are a part of that team of teachers where you have a couple of teachers that all teach the same grade level and content, here are some things that you can try that proficiency rubrics allow you to try. Bring a 3, 2, 1, and 0 example to a collaboration meeting that you've already graded. So say that you have 3 teachers on your team. Each person brings one example of a 3, a 2, a 1, and a 0. Or maybe just a 3 or just a 2 or 2 of them. It doesn't have to be all 4, but decide which you're going to look at, and maybe you start by saying, let's look at all of our 3s. What are we seeing that our students that are scoring 3s on the proficiency rubric are doing? What skills do these students have? How might we help other students that are not scoring 3s attain these same types of skills that we're seeing our students with 3s use? And you can repeat that for each of your proficiency rubrics, and it's just going to bring up a really great conversation about students and student learning. The next idea is to bring an ungraded assessment to a collaboration meeting and make copies so that each of your team members has the exact same assessment that hasn't been graded yet. Use your proficiency rubric then to individually grade that same assessment and then have a conversation as a team. What did you grade it? Why did you grade it this way? And what's going to happen is you are going to see some grading biases that maybe different team members have, or different ways that your team members think about grading than you do. Additionally, you are going to be able to define places on your proficiency rubric that maybe you need to add more detail into to define some of the inconsistencies that you and your team are having when you actually try to grade the assessment. So I'm going to challenge you to take a next step. If you've been with me for the last 13 minutes listening to this, I want to challenge you to do something about it. So figure out what that next step is for you. Don't feel like you would have to go out and do all your proficiency rubrics overnight if you don't have any proficiency rubrics right now. Start with one. If you are on a team of teachers, work collaboratively on proficiency rubrics at the start of a new unit or just prior to a new unit. Make that part of just what you do. So know that, okay, we've got a new unit coming up. It's a writing unit. We know that we're going to be going through the writing process. And by the end of this narrative writing unit, students need to write memoir vignettes. So we are then going to build that proficiency rubric based on what we want students to know, and we can then use that throughout the unit to guide our instruction and our lessons. Also, if you are a middle school reading teacher and want reading units that have this done for you, I do have reading units available that include 20 reading mini lessons. Each of the reading mini lessons has a formative assessment with a coordinating proficiency rubric. Each reading unit also contains an end of the unit summative assessment with proficiency rubrics for each of the priority standards that summative assessment assesses. So lots of pieces here. I hope that you will check out a next step and let me know if you have any questions about proficiency rubrics in the comments below. Thanks for tuning in.